Alright guys, so now we're going to look at a couple hooks that we haven't used yet, including useRef, useMemo, useCallback, and I'm also going to show you how to create custom hooks. We're going to create a custom useFetch hook and a custom useLocalStorage hook, and these aren't full projects or anything, they're just smaller examples just to kind of show you how this stuff works. So I just have a folder called React Sandbox. What we'll do is just set up a brand new Create React app and just create these files as we go. useRef, I have a couple different examples, and we'll code this out. You can follow along, and we'll learn a little more about some of the hooks that are included with React, as well as how to create your own custom hooks. Alright guys, so I have a brand new React application here. I just call this React Sandbox because that's what it is. It's not any specific project. We're just going to use it to, I'm going to use it to just show you a couple things. And I just cleared up some files here. We cleared up my app component, and I did include Bootstrap. I just include the CDN in my public index HTML. So if you want to get all that set up and follow along, I would suggest that you do that you follow along and code with me instead of just watching it, because I do think it helps people retain more. So in this video, we're going to look at useRef, which is a hook that we haven't looked at yet or talked about yet. And it essentially allows you to create a reference to a DOM element in a functional component. And you can actually create a reference. It doesn't have to be to a specific DOM element, and we'll get into that later, because there's a few different scenarios where you might use useRef. So I'm actually going to give you 3 different examples. So the first is probably the most common, and that's to get a reference to some element in your component that you want to do stuff to, whether it's get its value or change some of its style or whatever you want to do with it. So I'm going to create a new component, a components folder here, components folder, and inside the components folder, I'm going to create a file called useRef example1.jsx, because like I said, we're going to have a couple examples, and I don't know if I'm going to create a GitHub repository for this. I might just include it in a zip file, and you guys can download it if you want. But again, I would suggest you follow along. So let's create a React component here. We'll just keep it as useRef example1. And just for now, we'll just say useRef. And I just want to bring this into app.js. So we're going to go to our app.js, and let's import useRef example1, and then we'll replace this h1 right here with useRef example1. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a form here, and in the form we're going to have we'll just say label, and we'll say name. This could be anything, and we'll have an input, and let's give that a class of form-control. And let's do MB2, so just some Bootstrap classes, and we can give it an ID of name, although we don't have to. And then let's create a button, and we'll give this a type of submit, and let's say submit, and then we'll add, let's say class name, set that to BTN and BTN-primary. So we got a basic form here. Now the example I'm going to give you is this input. I want to reference to this input form, and this is kind of an alternative to the normal way of doing things, where every input we have a piece of state for. Like we might bring in useState, we'll have name set name equals useState, and then on the input we'd have the value of name, and then an onChange event or event handler that will get called, and then we'll set whatever we type in to that piece of state. So that's kind of the normal way of doing things when you work with forms. But there might be cases where you want to get the value, but you don't want to have that connected to any state. So useRef is a way that we could do that. So let's go ahead and import here useRef, and that's going to be from React. And then we want to create a reference. So up here, let's say const. I could call this anything. I'm just going to call it input ref and set that to useRef. And then this input here, I'm going to add an additional attribute of ref and set that to the variable of input ref. So now I have a reference to this input, and I can do whatever I want with it. So let's create an onSubmit handler here. Let's say on submit, and we'll just set that to a function called onSubmit. And let's create that up here. We'll say const onSubmit, takes in an event parameter, and we just want to call e.prevent default. And just to make sure that's working, let's console log 123. So I'll open up my console here. If I submit, we should see 123. Okay, so if I want to get the value of that of that input, I could just console log here and take my input ref. Actually, first I want to show you what that gives us. So if I submit, if I put anything in here and I just submit, this gives me an object. Okay, useRef or reference is always going to give you an object with one property called current, and in that current is the actual DOM element. So you can see, like, all the different properties here and stuff. But if I were to console log just input ref.current, okay, so I'm just going to clear the console up here, type this in and submit. Now you can see that input ref.current is the actual DOM element. So if I want to get the value, I can simply do input.current.value. And now when I submit, it's going to give me whatever is typed in there. Okay, so this is kind of an alternative to doing it with the useState, but you don't really want to do this just for the hell of it. There might be some instances where you would, though. Now I could do anything with this reference. I could set the value. So if I want, I could say input ref.current dot and then we'll say value, and we'll set that to hello. So now if I come over here, I'll just reload this, and if I click submit, the value of the input gets set to hello. Let's say I wanted to change something in the styling. I could do input ref dot current dot style dot we'll do background or background color and set that to red. So now if I come over here and submit, it's going to set the value to hello, and it's going to set the background color to red. So you have all the, just like you would with vanilla JavaScript, you have all those methods and properties that you can use. And it's really important to understand that when you change a reference value, it does not re-render the component as if you were to set a state value. So this doesn't have to be just inputs. We could create a reference to anything. In fact, we'll go ahead and just create a paragraph here, and we'll just say hello, and then on this paragraph I'll put a ref to, let's say, para-ref, and then we'll create that reference up here. So const para-ref, set that to useRef, and then maybe when we submit we want to change the text of that, so we could just do para-ref.current, and then we'll say inner text and just set that to, let's say, goodbye. Okay, so now when I click submit, you'll see that paragraph will get changed to goodbye. And we can also, so let's say we want to click on the paragraph and then focus on the input, so we won't get the cursor to go inside the input. On the paragraph, we'll say on click, and we'll just have a function, and we'll just have the input ref, and we'll do dot focus. So now if I come over here and I click on the paragraph, I'm sorry, that needs to be on dot current. That's something that I do quite a bit, is forget the current. So now if I click on the paragraph, you can see how we're not focused in now, but if I click on the paragraph, then that input gets put into the focus state. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how useRef is used in this scenario where you want to get a reference to a specific DOM element. In the next video, I'm going to show you how we can use the useRef hook to get previous state. All right, guys, so in this video, I want to show you another reason you might want to use the useRef hook, and that's to get your previous state. So we're going to go ahead and close up the example one, and let's create a new file in components called useRef example2.jsx, and then we'll create our functional component here, and let's just do useRef2 for now. Oops, we don't want it down here. And then we'll bring that into our app.js, so we'll just replace the one here, here, and here with a 2, and save. And make sure we save this one as well. All right, so now we have our example 2. So we'll close that up, and then up top we're going to bring in 3 different hooks. We're going to bring in useState, useEffect, and useRef. And what I want to do is basically count. I want to set a reference to the number of renders, because remember, we don't have to just have a reference to a specific DOM element. So what we'll do is we'll create a reference here, let's say const, and we'll call this renders, and we'll set that to useRef. And when we set it to a DOM element, remember I just left in here just empty. Well, you can pass in a default value for this reference, which in my case I'm going to set to 1, because when we first load the component, that's the first render. So I'm going to set that to 1 by default. And then what we'll do is have a use effect here and create our function. And what I want this to do is set the render to 1 ahead of it, right? So if we render again, renders will get set to 2, then 3, and so on. So let's say renders.current, and we're going to set that to just renders.current, so whatever it is, and then +1. And then we'll display it down here. Let's just have an h1 here, and we'll say renders and set that to renders.current. Okay, so now we see renders 1, right? It's the component has been rendered 1 time. Now remember, whenever we update any state in the component gets re-rendered. So let's create a piece of state up here. So we'll say const, and let's say name and set name. So that's going to be use state, which will just be an empty string by default. And then down here, let's put an input. We'll just give it a class of form-control and MB3. And we want to make the value of this the name, and of course we want an onChange, and in our onChange we'll have a function that's going to call setName, and we need to pass in our event parameter here, and then we want to set name to e.target.value, because that's whatever we type in. Right, so now if I go in here and I type something, we're going to see renders 2, and every time I type something the state changes, so the renders increases by 1, or increments by 1. Now there might be cases where I want to get the previous state. So the previous state for me right now would be this, right, because the current state is this. So we could create another reference here, let's say const, and we'll call this prev name, and we'll set that to useRef, and this will be empty by default. And then in here in our use effect, we'll say prev name dot current, and then we'll set that to name. And then we want to add as a dependency to this use effect, we want to add name. So every time name changes, this is going to run, and we're going to store the previous state in this prev name dot current. So what I'll do is come down here, we'll just add an h2, and we'll say prev name state, and then we'll output here prev name dot current. All right, so now if I type in A, the previous state obviously was nothing. If I type in B, now the previous state is A. C, the previous state is AB. D, so the current state's ABCD, the previous state is ABC. So there are going to be instances where you might need to get the previous state. And again, not necessarily on an input, but any kind of state. All right, so in the next video, we're going to address a specific problem where you get a memory leak error, and that's when you fetch something from a backend, some kind of API, and then the component unmounts before the response comes back. So we're going to look at that issue in the next video. All right, so the last scenario that I want to show you that we can use the useRef hook to fix a problem is a problem that we're actually going to run into in the Firebase project. And that is when you make some kind of fetch request and then the component unmounts before handling the response, you get an error about a memory leak. So the first thing we're going to do is create this scenario, and then I'm going to show you how to fix it. So let's go ahead and create a new component here, and we'll call this useRef example3.jsx. And in addition to that, I'm going to create a component called to do, because we need a component that's going to make a fetch request that we can unmount before we get the response back. So let's create a new component here. I'm going to call it to-do.jsx, and we're just going to work with the typecode JSON placeholder fake REST API. And you can use any API if you want. So in app.js, let's change this, and this to 3, example 3. That's what we want to show here. And let's create a function here. So this is useRef example 3. Let's say useRef 3 and save, and that should display here. All right. So let's see, trying to figure out how I want to do this. In the to-do component, let's just create a function first, and for now, we'll just say to-do. And we want to show this on the screen, but we want to be able to toggle that component. So first off, let's bring in to-do. So we'll say import to-do from /to-do. And we're also going to want to bring in useState. So let's import useState. useState from React, and then let's go down here and create a piece of state, and I'm going to call this show to do. So show to do and set show to do, and say use state, and the default for this is going to be true. Okay, and then down here, let's see, get rid of this, and we want a conditional here. And we'll say if show to do, then we'll display the to do component. So if I save that right now, we should see to do because it's set to true by default. So let's go underneath that and let's create a button. And I'm just going to give this a class of btn. Yeah, btn and btn primary. And we'll just say toggle to do. And then we want to add an on click. And we'll just set this to, we'll just do it right in here. So on click, we want to then set, what is it? No, set show to do. We want to set that to the opposite of whatever it is. So the opposite of show to do, so that we toggle it. So now if I click that, now it's gone, click it again, then it shows. All right, so that's really all we need this specific component to do. No pun intended. So in the to-do.jsx, this is where we actually want to make our requests. So let's go up here and let's import. We want to bring in useState, useEffect, because we're going to make the request right away, and then useRef. And then inside of our function here, let's add our state. So we're going to have a loading state, so loading and set loading. And that's, I'm going to set that to true by default, and then once we make the request, we'll set loading to false. And then of course we need somewhere to store. We're just fetching a single to do, so it's not an array, it's just going to be a single object. So set, but it doesn't really matter what you're fetching. So this, let's see, use state, and that's just going to be set to an empty object by default. And then let's add our useEffect. Okay, and we want this to run right away, so I'm just going to add an empty array dependency here. And then I'm going to make a fetch request to HTTPS, and the URL is jasonplaceholder.com/typecode/ I'm sorry, no, it's jasonplaceholder.typecode.com. And then we can do /to-dos. That will get us an array, but I just want to get a single to do, so I'm going to do /1. All right, and then we're going to do .then, and let's get our response, and say res.json, and then .then, and then we get our data. And then here is where I want to set the to-do. I want this to take extra long though, because we need some time for it to, when it's sending, I want to basically have it displayed. It's going to make the request, and then we're going to toggle it out. So we're going to dismount it and or unmount the to-do component. So let's wrap it in a set timeout just to make it a little longer. So we'll say set timeout, and that's going to take in a function, and then it also takes in how long we want to wait before we execute this. So let's do 3 seconds, 3000 milliseconds. And then in here in the set timeout, that's where we want to do the actual set to do and change our state, which we're going to set to data. And then let's also set loading to false. All right, so that'll make the request. Now down in the return, let's say if loading, then we'll have an h3, we'll say loading ... else, then we'll have an h1, and we'll just show in here the to-do title. All right, so let's go ahead and just reload this, and we should see loading ... until we get the title, which comes back, and the reason it took so long is because of the set timeout, right? If we change this to 1 second and we reload, it's going to be quicker, but I want to set it to 3 so I have time to toggle it out. So what I'm going to do is open my console up, and useRef is not defined. That's okay, we haven't used it yet. So I'm going to just reload and then toggle it out, and we'll see what happens. So I'll reload, it's fetching, I'll unmount it, and when it comes back, what we get is this can't perform a state update on an unmounted component. It indicates a memory leak in your application. To fix, cancel all subscriptions and asynchronous tasks in a useEffect cleanup function. So we want to handle this error, and again, this is something that we run into with Firebase. It's actually an issue with React and Firebase, and we're going to handle it in the same way in the project. So you'll actually see it in a real project. So what we can do here is, first of all, create a reference pertaining to the component being mounted. So we want to be in our to-do JSX. We already brought in useRef, so let's create a reference here. We'll say const, and we're going to call this isMounted, and set this to useRef, and the default for this is going to be true. Okay, now down here in our useEffect, when you return, if you want something to happen when a component is unmounted, you return it from the useEffect. So we want to make sure outside of the fetch, but still in the useEffect. And I'm going to return here an arrow function, and just for now, I'm just going to console log 1, 2, 3. All right, so let's reload this. And we can let that fetch, that's fine. But you'll see when I toggle this, it's going to cause an unmount of the to-do component, so then this should run. So I click toggle, and now we see 1, 2, 3. All right, so I'll put a comment here, and we'll say that this runs when component is unmounted. Okay, so what we want to do is in this return, let's get rid of this console log, we want to set isMounted, which is a reference. We want to set the dot current, set it to false. And then before we set our data here, before we set our state, we want to make sure that it's mounted. So we want to just wrap this in isMounted dot current. And then that's where we actually want to put this. Okay. And then we just want to add as a dependency here isMounted. So now let's just reload this, and while it's fetching, I'm going to toggle out, and then we shouldn't see that error. So this is another helpful use of the useRef hook. All right, guys, so now we're going to look at the useMemo hook, which deals with memoization and computed values. So this isn't a hook that I use all that much. You probably won't either. I would say that you should really only reach for the useMemo hook or the useCallback hook, which we'll be talking about next, if you're experiencing performance issues. There are consequences to overusing it, and a lot of times it's just unnecessary. So I would say reach for it if you're seeing performance issues. So let's talk about memoization real quick, because obviously you need to kind of understand how that works to use the useMemo hook. So memoization is an optimization technique that speeds up performance by storing or caching the result of an expensive function call when the same inputs occur, or when it has the same arguments. And what I mean by an expensive function call is a function that takes a lot of resources, that takes a while to execute and complete. You know what I mean. If you're searching through thousands of records in a database, or if you're doing something with video processing or some kind of computation that just takes up a lot of time, that's an expensive function call, and that's where useMemo and memoization can help you out in performance. So let's go ahead and create a new component. So in components, create a new file. We'll call this useMemo example.jsx, and then let's create a function, and for now we'll say useMemo. Save that, and then in our app.js, let's replace this useRef example3 with useMemo example. Okay, so we should just see useMemo on the screen. So let's go ahead and bring in a few hooks that we're going to be using here. So we want useState, we're going to be using useEffect, useRef, and of course useMemo. And that's from React. All right, so we'll create a couple pieces of state here that we're going to be using. The first is going to be number. So number, and set number is the function to manipulate that piece of state, and the default for that is going to be 1. And then we're also going to have this default's going to be 0. This is going to be called inc, or increment. So this one will be set inc. Okay, now I want to have a value for the number of renders that have happened. So we did this in the last video too. We're going to use useRef for this. So we'll say renders and set that to useRef and default that to 1. And then we'll have our useEffect. So our useEffect function, and then we'll take renders.current, and we're going to set that equal to renders.current, but we want to just add 1 to that. So plus 1. And yeah, and then we'll just show that down here in the UI. So let's just have an h3 and say renders.current. So if we save that, now we should see 1. Actually, I'm just going to add a label here of renders so we know what this is. Okay. And we're going to have an input. So I'm going to go right above this and have an input here. We'll give it a class name of form-control and width-25. And this is going to be a number input, not text. And basically, I'm going to add a value here of number, so that number state, and then we need an onChange so that when we type in the input, or when we change the number, it changes the state. So we'll have a function in here that's going to call set number, and it's going to get set to e.target.value. And of course we need to pass in e here as our event parameter. And now we should be able to change this, and anytime we change this, whether we use the arrows or we type in, it's going to re-render the component. We can see the number of times it's being rendered. Now as for this inc value, let's have a button that we click to set that, to increment this number right here. So we'll have a button, give it a class of btn and btn primary. And in here we'll just say, let's say re-render, because that's really the point of this button. Because whenever you change a piece of state, it's going to re-render the component. So let's have an onClick here, and we'll set that to an onClick function. And then the onClick will create right here. Okay, and then what this is going to do is set inc. And I just want to increment the number, so we'll pass a function in. That way we can get the previous state or the previous number, and then we can just go ahead and return the previous state plus 1. And then let's also just do a console log of that as well so we can see it. We'll say previous state plus 1. So now if we open up our console here, and I hit this re-render, it's going to do a couple things. First, it's going to re-render. As you can see, every time I click, it re-renders. Also, it's going to increase that ink value by 1. Now, this is just kind of all the setup to what I actually want to show you. So let's say that we want to get the square root of this number right here. We have an expensive function to do that. Now, getting the square root is not actually an expensive function, but what we'll do is we'll add a for loop in it to make it expensive and make it take a couple seconds or whatever. So let's have a value here called square root, or sqrt. We'll set it to a function called get square root, which is our dummy, our dummy expensive function. So that's going to take in number. So it's basically a computed function. And then that square root we're going to display down here. So I'm going to go above the button. We'll have we'll just do an h2 here, and I'm going to give it a class of my3 just for some margin. And in here we'll say the square root of number is, and then square root. And then we'll create the actual function. So let's go down here and say function get sqrt, which takes in the number. And to actually return the square root, really easy, we're just going to use math sqrt and then pass in the number. However, I also want to add in here a console log. So in here we'll say expensive function called, and then to make it actually expensive and make it take a little while, I'm going to put a for loop in here. We'll say for let I equals 0, and then we'll say as long as I is less than or equal to 10,000, and then we'll have I++ to increment by 1. And then all I'm going to do in here is console log what I is. So let's save that, and you'll see it's going to run right away, because this is going to run every time we have a render, right, at this point. So if I change the value of the number, that causes a render, and notice it takes a little bit to actually get the new render and get the square root. So if I click it, it takes a little bit. You can see it counting down here. That's just because it has to go through 10,000 times before it actually returns the square root. Now this also happens when I just click the button, and all that button is doing is changing the ink, right? It's not doing anything that has to do with the number. It's simply just changing the ink, and this could be doing anything. I just chose it to increment that ink value, but that causes a re-render, and it also fires off square root. Now when we click this and we change ink, we're not changing the value of number. So this is a good opportunity to memorize this get square root function, or memorize the value from it. So to do that is pretty simple. I'm actually going to just copy this down and then comment this one out just so you can see the difference. And we just need to set this to useMemo, and useMemo takes in a function, and then I'm just going to take our get square root here and put that in here. Now useMemo takes in a second parameter of a dependency array, just like useEffect and useCallback. So our dependency array is just going to take in number, okay, because it depends on that number. So let's save this, and you'll see if I change the number value, then yes, it does call the expensive function call. However, if I click this, notice it's not calling it's not going over it again, because it's memoized the value from square root, because this number isn't changing, the input isn't changing, so there's no reason to call the whole thing again. Okay, again, if I change the number itself, it is going to call the expensive function call, because that's the input. If the inputs change, then it's not going to get memoized. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And obviously this isn't really a very practical example, but this is a case where you're saving on performance. Every time I'm clicking this, I'm not having to wait for that expensive function call. All right, so in the next video, we're going to talk about useCallback, which is similar, but instead of memoizing the return value, it actually memoizes the callback, the entire function, but we'll talk about more about that next. All right, so now we're going to look at the useCallback hook, which is another hook that you can use to optimize your application. And in some ways it's similar to useMemo, but the big difference is that useMemo returns a memoized value and useCallback returns a memoized callback function. So they're used in the same way, both expect a function and an array of dependencies. useMemo calls the function and returns the result when the dependencies change, and useCallback returns the function when the dependencies change. So let's start out here by just creating a new component as we have been, and we'll call this useCallback example.jsx. Say useCallback, and then let's go to our app.js, and we're going to change this, actually this, and this to useCallback example. Okay, so we're gonna, first of all, as far as what we want to bring in here, we're only going to bring in, aside from useCallback, we're going to bring in useState and useCallback. And then let's create some state here. We're going to say const, and we'll say we have tasks. Okay, so task and set tasks. Use state, and the default for this is just going to be an empty array. And then let's have a function here called add task. So we'll say add task, and we're going to set that to a function. And all we're going to do here is set tasks, and let's pass in a function here so we can get the previous state, and then we're going to set it to an array that has the previous state, and then in addition to that we'll just have some task. So every time we run this function, it's just going to add a new task of a string called some task. So it's not doing very much here. And then down here in the return, we want to have a new component which I'm going to call button. Okay, so we'll have a button here, and we'll create that component. We could do it in a separate file, but I'm just going to create it here. So we'll say const button, and that's going to take in some props, specifically a function called add task. We're going to pass that into this component. And in here, I'm just going to do a console log just so we know that the button rendered. And then let's have return, and so div, and then we'll have a button, and this button is going to have an on click. So on click, and that on click is going to call that add task. All right, so we've done this before where we've had functions being passed in, and then passed in as props. So when this add task is called, it will then pass it up here into the button. So here we'll say add, or let's call this, no, yeah, we'll just do add task, and then we'll call add task. All right, so hopefully this makes sense. We have a button, we click that, add task gets called, it's passed in as a prop, and then it calls this function here. If I save that, we should just see a button. Let's give this a couple classes actually, just to make it look a little better. So class name, and set that to btn primary. All right, now let's open up our console, and we just see button rendered, and every time I click this, we're going to see that button rendered. Now let's show the tasks. So in the return here under the actual button, we can take the tasks and we can create a list with map. So we'll pass in here for each task. We'll also get the index, and then we'll just show a paragraph, and this needs to have a unique key since this is a list, and we'll use index for that. And then in the paragraph, we'll show the actual task. It's just an array of strings. Okay, so we just see some task. If I clear it, we start off with an empty array. I click this, we get some task gets added because we call this function. Click it again, and you can see the button continues to be rendered down here. Now, there's something called React.Memo, which is a high order component, or an HOC, and it's basically a component that takes a component as a prop and prevents the re-rendering if the props or the values within it haven't changed. So we can essentially memoize a whole React component. So I want to do that with the button component, this right here. So we want to bring in up top React outside of the curly braces, and then we should be able to, where we set our button, we want to wrap React.Memo around this whole function, around the whole component function. So React.Memo, open parentheses, and then we'll add the closing parentheses at the very end here. Okay, now if we go ahead and do this, we should still see the button rendered. However, we can now use useCallback within this add task function. So it's the same signature as useMemo. It just takes a function and it takes some dependencies. So let's say useCallback, and then I'm going to take the function. So we're going to take all this, cut that, and we want to put that in the useCallback. Okay, so we have our function, and then we want to pass in an array of dependencies, and the dependency is set tasks. Okay, so now if we come over here, and I'm just going to reload, and if I click it, notice that it's working. We're adding our task, but the button is not being re-rendered. It's been memoized along with this entire add task callback here. Okay, so that's going to save you some time if this were more complex. I mean, this is obviously very simple, and this definitely isn't a case where you would use this, but the point is to show you how to use it and how it works. And I can't stress this enough that I would only reach for something like this if you were having performance issues. Don't just do it just for the hell of it. If you notice certain things are slow in your application and you have expensive function calls, then you want to look at some of these hooks. All right, guys, so we've gone over quite a few of the hooks that are included with React. Now I want to start to talk about custom hooks and show you how we can create custom hooks, because you're not stuck with just the ones that come with React. There's tons of custom hooks all over the web. You can also create your own. The two that we're going to create are pretty common. You can find different variations of them all over the web, but I think that they're two very, very useful hooks, and that's going to be a useFetch hook to make HTTP requests, and also a useLocalStorage hook to store items in local storage as well as your state. So these two hooks are very useful, and they use them quite a bit, or different variations of them. So we're going to start with the useFetch. So first thing we'll do is in our source folder here, let's create a new folder called hooks. So usually you'll have in your file structure, if you have any custom hooks, you'll store them in a folder called hooks. And then we're going to call it useFetch.js. So your hooks should always start with the word use. And then we can actually start this off just like a React component. So we'll do RFCE, and it's just a function. That's all a hook is a function, except we're not going to return JSX in this, or at least for this hook. So we'll get rid of that, and I'm going to bring in up top here, I want to have use state and use effect, because we're going to have state for the loading. If it's loading, true or false. We want a piece of state for an error, if there's some kind of error from our response, and then data that will store the data that we're fetching. So we want to bring in use state and also use effect, because that's where we want to make the request. So we'll bring in use effect from React. Okay, and then in the useFetch, let's go ahead and use the use effect, because this is where we want to make our request. So this is going to take in a function, and actually we should probably add our state first. So let's say const, and I'm going to have this be loading, and then set loading, and we'll set that to use state, and that's going to be I'm going to set it to true by default, and once we make the request, get the response, then we'll set it to false. And then we're going to have two more pieces of state, and these are both going to be null. So one is going to be for the error. So if we get some kind of error, and we'll say set error, and then this is going to be the data that we get back, so this will be set data. Okay, so in the use effect here, we're going to have an asynchronous function called fetch data. So we'll set that to async, and then we want to call that down here. So we'll say fetch data, and then inside the function here, let's say const. Actually, let's do that. Let's do a try catch here. So put a try catch, and inside the try, let's do a const response and set that to await, and we're using the fetch API. And then what's going to happen is we'll pass in to useFetch. We want to pass in URL and then also options, because when you make a fetch request, you can also send options as well, like the method if you want it to be a post request or whatever, any headers, things like that. So in here we're going to pass in the URL and then any options, and options will be an object, so URL options. And then after that we want to get the JSON data, so we'll say JSON, set that to await response.json, and then we're going to go ahead and set data. Actually, we'll call that data instead of JSON. So data, and then we'll set data to the data we get back, and then we'll set loading, and we want to set loading to false. Okay, now if there's some kind of error, so that's why we did a try catch here, if there's an error, we can then set error to whatever that error is, and then I'm also going to set loading to false. All right, now as far as the dependencies here, it's gonna, if we just do this, it's gonna complain that we're not adding URL and options. If we do that though, we're gonna get a never-ending loop. So I'm just gonna use the ESLint disable comment, which is this right here, ESLint disable next line, just so it doesn't show a warning. And then all we want to return from this is going to be what our state, our loading, error, and data. So we'll go down here and we'll just return, and in curly braces we want to return the data, loading, and error, and that should do it. So now to use this, let's go into our components folder and let's create a new file, and we'll call this we'll call it custom hook example1.jsx. Okay, then we'll create a React component, and then we just want to bring in our useFetch hook, so we'll say import useFetch. And before we do anything, let's just get this shown on the screen. So we'll say useFetch down here and go to our app.js, and I'm going to replace this useCallback example. We want to replace all these with custom hook example1. So now we should just see useFetch here. All right, so in the custom hook example, because we're done with the hook, this is all we have to do here, so we can close that file up. Now to use it, all I'm going to do in the function here is create a variable called res for response, set that to useFetch, and then we'll pass in here, I mean you could use whatever API you want. I'm going to use HTTPS and use JSON placeholder dot typecode.com / and we'll do posts. And then remember, it also takes in options, which for this is just going to be an empty object. And then let's just do a console log of res to see what we get. Okay, so you can see that at first it's getting the data, loading is set to true, and the data error is null. And then here loading true, and then the final render here loading is false. And you can see the data has the array in it, the 100 posts or whatever it gives us, and the error is null because there's no error. So now if we want to show this, we could, let's do we'll say if res dot loading, and we could even do this, we could destructure it. Instead of doing res here, we could get data loading error. And then we could go ahead and say if loading, then let's just return an H3 and say loading ... And then down here, once it's done loading, we could take our data and map through it, and we could say for each item, or we'll say for each post in this case, then let's go ahead and have an H3, and we'll give this H3 a key of, let's say, post.id, and then we'll just show the post.title for each one. So if I save that, there we go. So you can see we get loading, it fetches the data, and it goes ahead, it shows it all on the screen. All the titles are in H3s. We get this error is assigned but never used, so I mean we could just get that. We don't have to take the error, we could just get rid of it. Alright, so that's an example of a custom hook that can be pretty helpful, you know, so you don't have to do the use effect and all that inside the component. You get your loading state, your error, and so on. Alright, so in the next video, just to dive a little deeper into this, we're going to create a custom hook for setting data to local storage. Okay, so now we're going to start on our second custom hook, which is going to be used to set local storage. So instead of just setting it to the state, whatever it is, whether it's an input field or any kind of state, we'll set it to local storage. So I'm going to create the component first that we're going to use it in. So let's create a file here called custom hook example2.jsx, and we'll create a function here. And I want to use it like we use useState. So just to show you, we'll just import useState here for now. And then let's say we have a form and we have an input for a task. So we would do like const task set task, and we would set that to useState with just an empty string, right? We would do that, and then we'd have a form. So let's just create a form down here real quick. Yeah, so we'll give this form a class name of w-25, just so it doesn't go all the way across, and we'll have a div in here with the class of mb3, and then we'll do a label with the class of form-label, and for the label we'll say task, and then we'll have an input. So input, we would set, we'd set the value to the state task, and then we'd have an onChange, right? And then the onChange would be a function, and then we would call the set task, and we'd pass in here. First we need the event parameter, and then we would pass in here e.target.value, so that every time the onChange runs, when we type in it, it sets the task state. You guys know how this works. Right, so let's bring this into our app.js. So we just want to change this to example2, and we'll just add a class name to the input of form control. Actually, let's do w50. All right, so now as I type in here, the state gets filled. So if I go to, let's see, components, and we look at our state. So right here, state, whatever I type in goes into that state. So the custom hook that I want to create is going to do this same thing, except it's also going to set this to local storage at the same time. So now let's create a new hook. So we'll go into the hooks folder and create useLocalStorage.js, and we'll create a function here. And then the return, so what we're going to end up returning from here is going to be, in brackets, we'll have a local storage value, and we'll have set a function called set value, and we'll be able to use it. So if I go to my component here, and we can replace useState, instead let's import from that, let's import the use local storage hook, and instead of saying use state, I want to be able to say use local storage. And what this will take in is going to be a specific key that we want to use. In this case, we'll say task, and then the default or initial value, which to begin with will just be an empty string. And then this stuff down here would all stay the same. The value will be task, and then it's going to call set task, right? So if we go back to our local storage here, that's what we're going to return. Let's see, we're going to end up, this isn't going to work just yet, but we want to basically do the state stuff in here. So we're going to import use state, and then we're going to set here, just like we would in a component, we're going to set local storage, we'll say local storage value, and then to manipulate that, we'll say set local storage value, and that's going to be set to use state. All right, now, and we get set value is not defined, so we will have a function we'll call right here. It's called set value, and that's going to take in a value, and just for now we'll just I don't know, console log value, just so that this works. Okay, now in the use state here, we want if something is already in local storage with that particular key, which we need to pass in here, the key and initial value. All right, because what we're doing here is passing in the key and the initial value, so we're catching it here. And then we want to check to see if something is in local storage with that key. And I'm assuming that you know how local storage works. You can view your local storage. I don't know why I keep clicking on that. You can view it with application. And if you go to local storage right here, this will show your values. I have some stuff that isn't relevant to, I can actually clear this stuff up. Yeah, we don't need that. But we want to set a key. In this case, we're going to have a key of task. And then as we type in the input, we should see the value update in local storage, right? So in the use state, we're going to pass in a function, and then we're going to call another function. We could put the code right in here, but I'm just going to have another function called get local storage value. And that's also going to take in key and initial value, right? And then we'll just create that down here. That we can create that outside of the main function. So we'll say get local storage value, takes in a key and initial value. And then what we want to do is get it from local storage. So we'll say const, and I'll call this item from, or we'll just call it item from storage. And then we want to set that to local storage dot, and then get item. Okay, so that's how we can get from local storage, and we just want to pass the key in. So if there's already a key of task in there, in this case, the value will get put in here. Now what we want to return from here is that value, and if there's nothing there, then we're just going to return the initial value. So let's say return item from storage, and then use a ternary, and then we want item from storage if it's there. If not, then we just want to return the initial key. Initial value. Now I want to make this, I want to be able to store JSON as a string in here. So what we'll do is when we get the item from the storage, we'll just wrap it in JSON.parse. So we can parse it back to JSON if it's, if it's an array or whatever. Okay, so that takes care of that. Now, this set value should run anytime we update our state. So we should console, if we go to console, we should see if I start to type in here, whatever I type is showing up down here. So that value we then want to take, we want to set it to our state, to our local storage value state using this right here. And then we also want to set it to local storage. And then one thing we want to do before that is check to see if it's a function, because remember, when you use your set, whatever it is, like set task for instance here, you can pass in a straight value or a function. So we want to account for that as well. So I'll get rid of this console log, and then let's say const we'll say value to store, and we want to check to see if that's a function. And we can do that by saying value instance of, and then function. So that will be function, that'll be true or false depending on if it's a function or not. If it is, so if it is, then let's say value, it's going to be a function, and we pass in local storage value. If not, if it's not a function, then it's just going to be the value that's going to be stored in this variable. All right, then we want to, actually let's put a comment here. We'll say check if function, and then we want to set to state, and that's easy. We just call set local storage value, and we pass in the value, and then we want to set to local storage, and we do that with local storage dot set item. So let's say local storage dot set item, and we're going to set it as whatever the key is, and then the value is going to be this value to store, but we want to wrap it in JSON.stringify in case it's like an array, or you know, it's JSON or whatever. So let's say JSON.stringify, and then we'll pass in value to store. So that will save it to local storage, and that should do it. Every time we type in something in this input, it should save it to local storage. So let's save this file, and then let's go back to application. And then if I click in here and I start to type, you'll see that it gets added to local storage. If I reload, it's going to stay there, right? Even if, I mean, if I delete this, it's going to go away because this is attached to the local storage. But whatever I type in is going to stay. Now, let's say that we want to store an array. By default, you can't store an array in local storage. It has to be a string. However, we're running our value through JSON stringify, and when we take it out, we're doing JSON.parse. So our hook is done, but I want to just show you how we could use it in a different way. So let's say we want an array of tasks. So we'll say tasks and then set tasks, and the key is going to be tasks, and the default will be an empty array. All right, and then what we'll do is we'll have an on submit on this form. So let's say on submit, we'll set that to on submit to a function. Let's say const on submit, and pass in an event parameter here. We'll say e.prevent default, and then we just need to add a button to this form so we can submit it. So let's add a button, give it a type of submit, give it a class name of btn primary, and just say submit. Okay, so now we have a button. Let's just move the button outside of that div, so it's pushed down a little, and when I submit it, I want to take the task that's in there and I want to set it to an array and then put it in local storage. So the first thing we'll do in this on submit is, let's say const, we'll say task object, and we'll set that to an object that's going to have the task. So task, which is going to be whatever's typed in the form here, and since these are the same, we can just do task, and then we'll add on to that a completed value. So completed, and we'll set that to false, and then we'll add date, and we could set that to new date, and let's just do dot to locale date string. Okay, so that will create the object. Now we want to set that to tasks, so we call set tasks, and in here we're going to pass in an array. We want to spread across all the previous tasks, and we want to then just add the new task object. Okay, so now let's save that, and in here I'm just going to say task 1. Task 1 is in our task. It's just a string. If I submit, now that gets submitted. I mean, it gets stringified, but you can see it's in the format of an array, which has the the task title, the completed, and it should have the what else? The date as well. So if I add another one, let's say task 2, and I submit, that gets added as well. And if we want to display these on the screen, we could simply go down here and let's go under, we'll go under the, no, we have to stay within the form just because this, yeah, you know what we'll do is wrap this in a fragment. Okay, so now we'll put an HR here, and then we'll say task.map, and for each task, let's go ahead and just show an H3, and we'll give this H3 a unique key. Set that to task. We don't have an ID, so I'll just set it to date. And then in here, let's add the task. Well, I guess it would be task.task. I could have called this title or something, but whatever, that's fine. So let's save that, and now we can see our tasks. And if I refresh this, it's still going to show because it's in local storage. And since we're setting tasks, we're not using useState, we're using useLocalStorage, so it's going to search for a key with that tasks. If I add another one here, let's say 3, and I go ahead and submit that, that's going to get added as well. All right, so this is a very helpful hook, and you can use this for a lot of different app ideas.